And thanks also to the faculty at the Department of Economics for conducting a very important conference on the occasion of India completing 75 years of independence. And there are several issues that remain unaddressed after 75 years. And among these, you have growth-related issues, distribution-related issues, sustainability-related issues, all of which are being adequately covered in this conference. So my talk today will be about how inequality has evolved over the last 75 years. Ever since we have reasonably good data, and I'll try to capture the period from 1950 to about 2010 in detail, and then speculate a little bit on what happened over the last decade. Before I start, this whatever I'm presenting today is going to be drawn from a forthcoming book which is titled Class and Inequality in China and India, a comparative political economy perspective. So I compare Chinese inequality and Indian inequality between 1950 and 2010. And today I'm going to present the Indian part of that story. So I title the presentation, broadly as Indian Inequality Since Independence, a tale of two classes. And I think, the two classes that I'm going to talk about, the way they emerged, the way they consolidated themselves. And I think, it's also very important to understand these two classes, even in terms of the, major political transformations that have occurred in India over the last 10 years. So just to sort of, give you important landmarks, which this is well known. I think the first period, 1947 to roughly 1980, it was a low growth period. But the key point to note here is that, it was much higher than the colonial period, which witnessed negative economic growth. So the major discontinuity is 1947, not 1980. This is when, India moved from a negative growth to a positive growth. And inequality was not very low. It was moderate. And as I show, it was also declining, a little bit. The second major period is, when Mrs. Gandhi returns as the Prime Minister of India in 1980. And she takes a pro-business kind of approach, from being with the Communist Party of India, CPI, during the late 60s and 1970s. And she takes a pro-business approach. And this period is not entirely driven by private sector. I think, there's a lot of public sector growth during the 80s. It's actually a very interesting decade. 1980s, as I'll show, did not witness a major increase in inequality. But post 1991, when economic reforms are introduced, we started witnessing rising inequality. And post 2010, I say whatever trends are visible, so the slower growth that we have data, although around 2013, 14, there was a change in the methodology. So, of presenting GDP data. And although we can say it's lower growth, it's not entirely clear, how the new series and the old series are, interconnected. But I think in general, we could argue that, there's lower growth after 2010. And again, on inequality, we don't have any data. 2011 is the last data point from National Sample Survey Organization. But from whatever other sources like tax data or PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey, we could argue that there is rising inequality, during this period. And I'll talk about it at the end. So just to show you, this is a graph in which we plot time, years on the x-axis, and Gini coefficient of monthly per capita expenditure, consumption expenditure on the y-axis. And what you broadly see is between 1951 and 1960, there was a rise in inequality. I mean, the red line, the yellow line is the top line is the urban line, urban inequality line, and the yellow line, the middle line, is the overall inequality, and the the gray line is at the bottom, which is the rural inequality. So between 1950 and 1960, there was a rise in inequality, and then we see the longest period of inequality decline. Not very significant, but it's notable, from around zero point 0.4 Gini to around 0.3233. During the 1961 to 1975 period, and then there is a steady increase. 80s is stagnant, but 90s and post 90s there's a steady increase in the overall inequality. That's the story. And if you plot like Kuznets does, if you plot per capita income on the x-axis and Gini on the y-axis, again of monthly per capita consumer expenditure, you see something very similar. As income rises, initially there was a decline in inequality, and then there is an increase in inequality. For those of you who have engaged with Simon Kuznets on this question, it's just the opposite of what he argued. The story of Indian inequality follows a U-shaped pattern, not an inverted U pattern. So this is important. This is also true of China, a lot of other countries. And then, you begin to see an inequality decline, as I already mentioned, between 1951 and 83, if you take the whole period. But the significant chunk of decline happened between 1961 and 1975. And then inequality increase happens over the second period. But again, the major period when inequality increases is between 1991 and 2010. And it probably continues, in the post 2010 decade. I'm going to present a class narrative, to make sense of these changes, using Marxian class categories largely. And if we take the overall data and methodology, this entire presentation is based on the National Sample Survey consumer expenditure data. Initially, the first period, 1950s to 1980, I actually used Professor M.H. Suryanarayana, who used to teach at IGIDR. I think he is Professor Emeritus now. His inequality trend analysis, which was also, I think, his dissertation. So I used decile analysis. That's all. We don't have raw data for that period. So I used decile or decile analysis for this period. Post 1983, we have the raw data. Data are available in electronic form. So I will present detailed class analysis using various survey categories, for this period. So if we, the key periods, let me focus on the key periods given the shortage of time. If we want to understand in rural areas and urban areas, the longest period of continuous inequality decline in independent India, that is 1961 to 1974, I've split the population into bottom 10%, bottom 40%, middle 50%, and top 10. The story that we see in rural areas is the top 10% witnesses a decline from 22.6, 25.9 in 1961. That is the share of their consumption, the top 10% consumption in the total consumption. It declines to 22.6 by during those 14 years. The middle 50, on the other hand, increases its share from 52.6 to 55.2, and the bottom 40, there's not much of a change, 21.5 to 22.2. So the decline in inequality is being driven by the middle groups, basically. This is something to keep in mind as an insight. If we come to the urban spaces, again, bottom 10 increases from 3 to 3.8, not significant because, these are very poor. And then bottom 40 witnesses some increase, 19.1 to 21.4. Middle 50, again, they witness some improvement, 51.9 to 53.2. In fact, of all the groups, the middle 50 again in urban spaces make the best gains. And the top 10% witness a decline, like in rural areas, from 29 to 25.4. One thing to keep in mind is, these inequality estimates are underestimates, because the very wealthy, or the income rich, the top 0.1% or top 0.5%, are not captured in these surveys, as probably everybody knows. Unless we do oversampling of that group, we will not capture that top tail, the 0.1 or 0.5 or even top 1%. This is not the case only with Indian data. It is true of data from most countries in the world, including the US. So, understanding inequality decline between 1951 and 1983. This is basically, here I plot time on the x-axis, and y-axis. It's not Gini, but it's share of consumption percentiles. And if you look at the top line, this is the middle group. There is a slight improvement in the middle groups. And the second line is the top 10%. There is a decline in their overall share during this whole period. And the bottom 50, there's a slight improvement. And, sorry, the black line is the share of top 10%. And the red line here is the share of top 1%. And there you see a decline. But with the caveat that, this is not very well sampled, the top 1% of the population. So we do witness, some decline in inequality. So there's an overall improvement during this period of consumption distribution, which stands in, which is a substitute for income, which is a proxy for income. Although, consumption would be more equally distributed than income. This is also probably well known among economists. So why did this decline happen? And why is the decline not very significant? These are the things that I try to explain. There is a mild decline. It's not a major decline. If you go to the Chinese story, the decline in inequality is extremely sharp during this period, the same period. So if you look at the Indian state, it was ambivalent. On the one hand, the state failed to implement radical land redistribution, except in a few states, like Kerala, for instance. They were able to do better on the land redistribution, agenda. And food shortages were rampant, right, through the 50s and 60s. And we were also importing, PL 480 grains from the US on a large scale. But they were, once, there was a will, in the national state to solve this problem, it was not through radical land redistribution that the solution was arrived at, but through what we now know as the Green Revolution, which did not touch the land distribution as such. In urban areas, capitalist class was significantly protected. Now this is well known. I think the Indian state bought into the Bombay Plan, which was drafted mainly by the private capitalist groups, which also wanted, a public sector to support them. And they got significant protection in terms of tariffs and so forth. And this class grew stronger through this period before 1983. On the other hand, there were some weak land tenancy reforms. There was clearly public sector employment creation with the growth of the public sector. And there was some redistribution, as the data shows, between the top groups to middle income groups. That is the only redistribution that happened. The poor were somewhat untouched. By the late, in the early 50s, the poverty rate was around 40%. And the headcount ratio by the late 70s is still 40%. So, through the Nehru and Indira Gandhi period, the progressive period, I don't think Indian state was able to reduce poverty significantly. Poverty begins to go down in the late 70s and through the decade of 80s, in fact. And then, rural small peasants and landless workers, the classes of people who were very poor, and urban informal workers were largely left out. This is also now a well-known finding. Middle groups consolidated themselves, and the elites were protected. So you now see the two classes that are really emerging. And rural elites, did very well during the Green Revolution. Rich peasants did very well, but they started urbanizing themselves by the 70s and 80s. So rural elites come and join either urban elites or urban middle groups. So the dominant classes, if you take the whole country, through this whole period, it's the urban capitalist classes, urban professionals, people like us, or software workers, or pharmaceutical industry workers, or people who work for the government as bureaucrats and so forth. Those would be the urban professionals. And then rural, rich and middle peasantry, which started urbanizing itself quite significantly starting in the 70s. And the state balanced elite interests and the middle group interests primarily. And there's a little bit of, sops that were provided to the bottom groups, which did not make a huge dent during this period. So if we look at the period after 1980s, this is when raw data is available, electronic data are available, so we can do more careful analysis. If you look at the period 1983 to 2010, the Gini coefficient, doesn't change all that much through the 80s, between 1983 and 1994. It's roughly stagnant, but what it hides is urban inequality is rising during this period, while rural inequality is declining. So they balance out. But after economic reforms, liberalization policies are implemented, we actually see, a steep increase. This is more than a 10% increase in Gini of monthly per capita consumer expenditure, and a 10% increase in Gini is very significant for anybody who has worked with this index. Something very big is happening in society when Gini jumps by 10%. So how do we make sense of inequality? We can look at the rural-urban axis. If you look at this is a decomposition of the Gini coefficient using the Itzhaki method. And it gives you the within Gini, within group Gini, basically, within rural, within urban, and then between rural and urban. As you can see, the between component between rural and urban steadily increases. It was 1.46. This is the rural urban gap. The average urban income over average rural income or consumption was around 1.46 in 1983-84. It rises to almost 2 by 2009-10. So there's clearly a shift of various productive activities to urban, and those activities get more highly valued. So that gap is clearly there. Urban residents are consuming better through this whole period. And if you look at the regional story across Indian states, so you basically doing the same kind of decomposition. The between component, among all the Indian states explained about 6.5% of the total Gini in 1983-84, and it rises to around 16.7%. So the regional gaps are also rising through this period of 80s, and then when economic reforms are introduced. So if we look at the overall all India decile shares and we try to make sense of inequality, if we come down to the bottom 3 rows, I've presented bottom 40, middle 50, and top 10. Here, bottom 40 sees a decline. Unlike in the previous period, there's a slight increase for the bottom 40 in the first period until 1983. Here, there's a decline. If we look at the middle groups, middle 50%, then 52.32 was their share in 83. By 2009-10, their share comes down to 49.34. And if you look at the top 10%, it's a complete reversal of the earlier story. They increased their share from 27% to 31.25%. That's the story. It's the inverse of what happened in the 1951 to 83 period. So in a way, inequality comes a full circle by the end of this whole period. So making sense of inequality, I present the inequality decomposition using Eric Olin Wright's framework, and I have adapted that framework for Indian class structure in 2 papers written in 2010 and 2019. And I separate the formal sector from the informal sector in the latest paper that I wrote. I utilize Kalyan Sanyal's work, Rethinking Capitalist Development, where he makes a distinction between the accumulation economy and the need economy, to broadly talk about the formal and informal sectors in the economy. And the accumulation economy has elites, urban elites, professionals, and formal workers, whereas in the so this is for urban classes. Whereas within the urban, the need economy has informal workers, informal owners, and self-employed, the small tea shop owners, people like that. So if we look at the entire class structure, both urban and rural, and see who has made gains during this period and who has made relative losses. If we, these are the various classes: urban owners and managers. This is the formal professionals and formal workers. Then urban informal. I've combined self-employed and the owners here. And then you have the rural elite, small and marginal farmers, agricultural workers, landless agricultural workers, and non-agricultural workers. These are all the classes for the entire country. And if we look at what has happened for each class between 1983 and 2009-10, so this is the all India mean for all the classes, the entire population. And what these two columns, 83 and 2009-10, show is the ratio of the class average to the population average. So clearly, owners and managers in urban spaces, professionals, urban formal workers, they're all doing better than other classes. But the last column here, how did the ratio to mean, this ratio to mean here, how did it grow between 1983 and 2009-10? This will give you some kind of a relative, who has those classes that have made relative gains and those classes that have made relative losses. And the story is very stark. Urban owners and managers have made the most gains, as expected, as we know. Urban professionals have also made gains. This is the row. And urban formal workers also have made gains. These are skilled workers who work for the public or private sectors. But look at urban informal workers. There's a negative growth. Look at the rural elite in terms of their share, they've gone down. But it's important to remember that the rural elite has urbanized itself, right? So some of the older rural elite is now in the urban professionals or urban formal workers or urban owners and managers. And then small and marginal farmers have lost out significantly. Look at agricultural workers, they've lost out significantly in terms of their relative share. And non-agricultural workers in rural areas have also lost out. So the significant story here is there are two classes, urban owners and managers in the formal sector and urban professionals. These are the groups that have made relative gains and significant relative gains. So again, returning to the decomposition story, and if we decompose the Gini in class terms now, in terms of the classes that I have defined, if you look at the between term, between class inequality, how much does it explain the overall inequality? It was 17.1% in 83-84. It rises to 33% in 2009-10. But the significant thing I want to mention here is the between term, rises from 0.056 in absolute terms to 0.120. And the entire increase in Indian inequality can be explained through the increase in the between class inequality term in absolute terms. So the class story is extraordinarily significant. Whatever, in the political realm, it may manifest along other axes, other contradictions. But the underlying story of what has happened between 80s and 2010 can be best understood analytically in class terms. So what do we know about inequality over the last decade, 2011 to 2020, just before the pandemic, let's say? According to, we don't have data on consumption or income over this period. Periodic labor force survey data are available, but they're not strictly comparable. So it will be like comparing apples and oranges. If we put the NSSO data and PLFS, NSSO consumer expenditure data and PLFS data. But then from available sources, tax data and this PLFS data, if we just look at that period, when data are available, clearly inequality and poverty levels have increased, is the message that we get. And several people have written and commented on this. Uh, my own understanding is it's been a continuation in the last decade of inequality heightening policies, especially between formal and informal sectors. Whether we take something like demonetization, whether we take the GST, implementation of GST, or we take even the pandemic and how the pandemic was handled. I think the distance between formal and informal sectors has really heightened during this period. Uh, so the overall story between 83 and 2010, how do we make sense of the rising inequality? So I would think, the kind of capitalism that we brought into India is a global neoliberal, where market forces are privileged. The capitalist class is privileged over workers and peasants. And there's just to note a few important points. This is well known. There's been a slowdown in the agricultural sector relative to other sectors, and it has also manifested in the tragic phenomenon of farmer suicides in certain pockets of the country. I, in fact, in my dissertation, looked at farmer suicides in the Telangana region. But in certain pockets, the crisis, agrarian crisis, was deep and severe. Certain other pockets, it was milder, and it's not uniform across time. But nevertheless, there's a clear slowdown in the agricultural sector if you take the overall period. But then, if agricultural sector slowed down, services galloped forward. But the problem is high growth sectors like services have not created enough jobs. So the impact of agrarian distress is people have been pushed out of, push factors have, pushed a lot of landless workers or, even small peasants to seek urban employment. But then the higher absorption rates are in the urban informal sector and rural non-agricultural sector, not in the formal sector. This is well known again. Anybody who has looked at the employment data would know this story. As a rapid surplus extraction story in the high growth sectors, this is also something that a lot of people have worked on. There's been a significant productivity rise, but it's not matched by the rise in earnings. So rise in earnings is much lower than the rise in productivity, which means that the profits rise much faster. So a small group pockets, the improved productivity gains. There's also clearly unequal exchange between the formal and informal sectors. And the strange thing, informal sector is the sector that houses the poor. But in India and in a lot of, global South countries, the informal sector subsidizes the the formal sector. And that basically means, there's a transfer of value from the informal to the formal sector, which further impoverishes, which further worsens the income distribution. There's also during this period, again, not uniform, but across the country, there's been dispossession of rural, small peasants or middle peasants, and there's also a lot of financial speculation through this whole period. Both these processes also contribute significantly to rising inequality. So the new dominant class coalition are the urban capitalist classes and the urban professionals or the middle classes. And these are the two classes that have become really dominant. And as I mentioned earlier, rural elites in most of the high growth states have urbanized themselves. So they've joined one of these two classes. So that's the tale of, the long-term story of Indian inequality. So to conclude, before 1983, there was inequality decline. But this inequality decline happens primarily, and this is, as I was working with the data, it was also surprising to me when I looked at this. And I didn't find this, argued in a very similar way in many papers. It's basically the middle groups that consolidate. Upper groups lose some of their share, but, it's not properly sampled. But middle groups improve their share relative to, let's say, the bottom groups. And the bottom 40%, are left relatively untouched. This is also visible from the poverty data during that whole period. So inequality declines, but poverty is stagnant, before 1983, until 1977 especially, and then there's a slow decline in poverty. And 80s, there's a sharp decline. After 1983, there's a rise in inequality. I think, as I showed in the class structure table, informal urban workers, small peasants, landless workers, and non-agricultural workers lose their share to urban elites and urban professionals, and rural elites have urbanized themselves, and inequality rises. What happened to poverty? This is something that, we had multiple committees, Tendulkar Committee, Rangarajan Committee. There's a lot of confusion about what happened to poverty, but we certainly know that inequality has risen. On poverty-related issues, there's still a lot of methodological clarity that we need to achieve, and that debate continues. So, to sort of conclude, there are two classes that consolidate through this entire period. Urban elites have enriched themselves, owners and managers. And they also increasingly control. They also have rural properties, land ownership in rural areas, and the second class is urban professionals. So if you look at the entire period, 1951 to 2020s, these are the two classes that have really consolidated themselves to the relative negligence of the other classes. And to reiterate, what has happened, between 2014 and 2022, some of the political earthquakes that have occurred in this country. I think, these two classes are important to understand. I think it's their agency, that has brought in a particular political formation, and they significantly control what happens in the political realm. Of course, there is also a popular appeal that can be generated, to garner vote shares and so forth. This is not in contradiction with that point.